If you want to go ahead and get your lesson books out, we're in lesson 13, so page 27 in your book. Lesson 13 on page 27, and we are just getting ready to wrap up the piece that we've been in on 1 Kings. We've been talking last week about Solomon's decline, and so we first talked about the great wealth that Solomon had, his wealth and his wisdom, how he was renowned, and then we started to discuss how a lot of that wealth ended up leading to his downfall. There were several things that Solomon was doing that ultimately led to his downfall. The most well-known one, of course, was the great number of wives that he had and how they led him astray with worship of other gods. But there were other things as well. There were things like the horse trade that he was involved with, something that Deuteronomy warned against, trading and trying to acquire so many horses and so many chariots, acquiring wealth to himself. There were several things outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 17 that Solomon actually violated. And so these things ultimately led together and led to Solomon distancing himself from God. And so that's what we talked about last week. And so we actually left off talking about question number 11. Question 11 says, what were the two main consequences of Solomon's apostasy? What was the consequence of Solomon falling away? There were two consequences to this. Rick?
Well, I had down that God raised up adversaries against him, and the kingdom ended up being divided. He could take the kingdom away from him, except for...
Yeah. He raised up adversaries against Solomon, and remember, before this, Solomon was very blessed. Israel was at peace with their neighbors. They were in a great time. They weren't at war with anyone like they were in David's time. But now, as a consequence of Solomon's falling away, enemies are being raised up against them. And what was the second thing you said, Rick? It was enemies and...
The kingdom would be divided.
And the kingdom would be divided. Yeah.
He said he would still leave it one for David's sake.
Yeah, which was interesting. He was going to take the kingdom away, but he was going to leave him some of it, right? And that, to me, that was a very interesting way that God is still fulfilling his promises to man while allowing man free will and being able to mess up, right? He said that he was going to give, because of David and his blessing to David, he was going to build David a dynasty, and he was going to leave the throne of Israel to David's line. But Solomon messed up. And so a punishment would be to take it away. But he promised David that David would always have an heir to the throne that way. And so what he does is he takes away most of the kingdom from Solomon, and he leaves him some. And so this ultimately leads to a divided kingdom, which is still a problem. Any other comments, thoughts, questions on that particular question? Question number 12, this is talking about one of those consequences. It says, name the three adversaries that God raised up against Solomon. So he earned himself not one, but three enemies out of this. Who were they?
I only got two, really, I feel like. I got Hadad and Jeroboam. There's the mention of this Ahijah or Ahijah, the prophet, but I didn't know if he was truly an enemy. So I didn't know if that was the third one or not.
So I found in, let's see, we're in 1 Kings 10, by the way. 1 Kings 10 and verse 23 is where I found the third one. Or no, not verse 23. It's further down. Yeah, 1 Kings 11:23. I'm one chapter off. 1 Kings 11, chapter 23, or verse 23. It's Rezon, the son of Eliada. So we've got Hadad, Rezon, and Jeroboam. And Hadad was an Edomite, so he's of the royal line of Edom. Rezon, like we just said there, the son of Eliada. And then Jeroboam. And what do we know about Jeroboam? Why does he stand out as a significant adversary here? He was what?
He was an Ephraimite.
Yeah, he was an Ephraimite.
He says he was a servant of Solomon.
Well, who's he go? I guess it's better for me to say, who does Jeroboam go on to become? He goes on to become a king, right? We're talking about the divided kingdom.
He becomes the king of Israel.
He becomes the king of Israel, right? So Israel, well, the kingdom gets split in two, and there's Israel and then it's Judah, right? So it's split into a north and a south, essentially. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on that particular part? So the next section of our book, that actually wraps up this particular lesson. And we kind of skip over a couple books here. We completely skip over 2 Kings. We skip over Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Chronicles is a lot of information that's kind of supplementary to what you just read in Samuel and in Kings. And it's giving you details. It's essentially telling that story in a different way with a different purpose. So in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, they're kind of telling you the family story of how David's line gets started. Whereas in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the focus is a little bit more on holding up David as a figure of righteousness and telling more of the good stories that he did rather than the good and the bad, with a different purpose, and it's to inspire you a little bit more. And then we skip over a couple of other books, and I'm hoping that we can get back to those at some point. I'd like to build out some lessons to those. Yeah.
In the next section of this, if you go past what we're going to go into Job and Psalms and Proverbs and all that.
Do they circle back?
Yes, they circle back.
Okay. I didn't look far enough ahead then.
That's okay. I circled back. I looked.
Well, good. Then we will get to those
We
then.
will come back to this.
Good.
This is like an interlude.
So we're going to go ahead and jump ahead. We're going to go into the book of Job today. We're going to start out with Job. This should still be in the same book.
Okay.
You just got to flip a few pages through. Yeah, false advertisement there. Skip ahead a few pages, and this will be it'll be in section 6. It's page 3 of section 6. And so we start to get into the wisdom books. So things like Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, often considered wisdom books because of the wisdom that they hold. And so a little bit of background here before we dive straight into question 1. The setting here is in the land of Uz. And we're not told a lot about that land where Job is from. We know the name of it, but there are actually a lot of historical details that we don't have, that we aren't given in Job. And I think that there's a reason for that. That's probably intentional, because that's not really what the author is trying to point us towards in this book. We aren't meant to focus on the little historical details of when this took place and where. It's really, the book of Job is tackling issues of justice in God's character. And so the author is anonymous, but it's like they want us to focus on the issues at hand rather than get distracted by some of these historical events. Nevertheless, Job is one of the older books that's written. It seems to be one of the older ones from what everyone can tell. And I've read a few commentaries where people think that Job may have been the same man mentioned in a few other places in the Bible that's referred to as either as Jobab or Joab, as just a different variation of his name. But none of that's for sure. So like I said, a lot of these historical details we simply aren't given because it's not really relevant to what the book of Job is trying to get at. But let's go ahead and dive into Job, and we'll see what Job is about. So we'll start out. Let's go ahead and read the first couple verses here in Job because it's not too long. Job chapter 1, starting at verse 1 down to verse 5. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send word and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send word to them and consecrate them, getting up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Job did so continually. So, describe for me the character and the life of Job.
Well, first of all, he was a godly man.
He was a godly man, okay.
The most important, he was a rich man.
He was rich, yes, he's very wealthy.
Compassionate with his riches.
He was compassionate.
Had many children.
He had lots of children.
Had disaster that happened to him. That's the story of Job.
Okay.
Part of the story of Job.
What else? Rick? Sorry, Matt? I was looking at Rick.
It says he's the greatest of all the men in the East, so probably because of all this, he was maybe had a good reputation. He was considered the greatest.
A good reputation. Okay. Yep, that's good too. He offered burnt offerings for his children. Just in case they may have sinned. How many of us offer up prayers just in case for somebody? You know, if someone asks for prayers, we'll pray for them, right? If we know that someone is in need of prayers because they're struggling, we'll pray for them. But how many of us wake up and say, you know, there's a dear friend of mine and I want to pray for them just in case they did something wrong? So Job went the extra mile, you could say, when it came to prayer, right?
That made me think he might be a good father. Just because he was
Yeah.
looking out for his kids.
Could be a good father. Instead, he offered up these burnt offerings a quarter to the number of them all. So he did this for all of them. That's 10. That's a lot. This took up some of Job's time to be able to do this, right? This is a side note, but I've heard in some sermons where people will use they'll talk about Job's sons here and the fact that they hold these feasts, and they'll frame it in a way that these sons were having more like wild parties with these feasts. However, I don't necessarily think that that's the impression that Job here is giving. After all, Job himself is going and he's offering up burnt offerings not for the sins that his children have committed. If they were partying every day and every night, Job would know they were blatantly sinning. Job's offering up prayers in case they may have sinned. So I think the impression here is simply that this is a happy family. They're a close family. They have feasts on appointed days. It says they would hold their feast, each one on his day. Now, I don't know what his day means. Maybe they set up a schedule for each other. Maybe that's like their birthday. They all had a special day. But nonetheless, they all hold feasts, and they all go and attend each other's feasts, and they're close to one another. So I think more of what this is doing is showing a happy family, a very prosperous family, and one that's close-knit, more so than trying to say that, Job's kids were somehow unrighteous. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that would even kind of go against the point of this picture we're getting of this very righteous man. I think everything speaks to him being in the right, having a great family, and everything's perfect.
Yeah, I really do think that that's the point that you're meant to walk away with is there's no fault here. Job is living good life, a blessed life, a righteous life, right? So now question 2. All these things we've talked about Job, why is it important to have this description of Job at the beginning of the book? Why do we need that? I think, Rick, you were first.
So we would know that he didn't bring the suffering on himself in some way, that it was undeserved.
Okay. Did you have a different answer?
I would just build on that because he gets accused of the very fact, of the very idea that you must be unrighteous, and that's why these are happening, so you need to repent. But here we have established that that's not the case at all. He is righteous.
And he was strong in his faith.
Yeah, he's strong in his faith. Yeah, so I think the point here is that we need to know this up front as the readers, as the audience who's being told this story. We need to know this because for the next 30-something chapters, Job's righteousness is in question by his friends. And so we as the readers need to understand where Job actually is at, where his standing with God is, so that we can properly understand these discussions that are about to happen. Because Job's going to keep saying over and over that he's innocent, and his friends are going to keep suggesting otherwise. And so we as the audience, so that we're not confused, we need to know what Job's relationship with God actually was. And so we have that listed out for us here. It tells us what kind of man that Job is, that he's a righteous, upright man, right? And even if you drop down to verse 8, let's read that for just a second. In verse 8, God is talking to Satan, and he says, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Okay, so we have it on the highest authority. This isn't even just from the author's point of view or something like that. This is God making a statement about Job's character. From the highest of the high, we know that Job is righteous. He is a blameless and upright man. So that's a very important fact that we're going to need to keep in mind. Question 3. Since the name Satan means adversary, why is it such an appropriate name for this character? So we're introduced to Job here for a minute, but then we kind of take a step back and we're transported and we see this heavenly scene, right? God is holding court, so to speak, and the angels are presenting themselves before him, and in walks this character named Satan, right? And Satan means adversary. It can also be translated accuser, right? Things like that. So why is adversary such a fitting name for this person?
Because he's just the opposite of being righteous.
He's the opposite of being righteous, okay. Matt, what were you going to say?
Verse 9, after the Lord honors Job and indicates that he's righteous, Satan is like, well, you have no reason. You put a hedge around him, and take that away from him. He's accusing Job of only being righteous because of the things God's blessed him.
Yeah, he's saying that Job, well, of course he's good. You've given him everything he wanted. What reason does he have to be bad, right? And he's saying, but if you took all that away, he would be like anybody else, and he'd be bad, right? He's actively working against Job, this guy who's done nothing wrong, who's just minding his own business, doing what's right. And here Satan is trying to stir up trouble against Job, right? Yeah.
I think Satan not only wanted to cause trouble, he wanted to degrade him. He wanted to prove to God that he didn't have anybody that big.
Yeah, he really, really wanted to attack Job, right? And so, sorry, go ahead.
Lord in a way too. Verse 10. Have you not put a hedge around him? It's like he's accusing the Lord of setting this up and rigging the game. You might say.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and accusing God of blessing Job to the point where, of course, he's going to do right. He would never do anything wrong because of the way that you've protected him. He says you've made this fence around him. So we can see that in some way God is protecting Job, holding Satan back. Go ahead.
But God presented Job to Satan. Have you thought of this my servant?
Yeah, have you considered my servant?
So I'm thinking that God is presenting him because he's sure.
And why do you think that God brings Job up? Because what happens here is the angels are presenting themselves before the Lord. Satan comes among them. He asks Satan, where are you coming from? Satan answers the Lord, from roaming the earth, from going back and forth. And then out of the blue, God brings up Job. Why do you think that is?
He wanted to debate Satan.
You think he wanted to debate him?
I think he wanted to, say, look at my man. No matter what you do, you can't get it.
Okay.
I think that was the intention.
Donna?
I used to think that God threw Job under the bus. And then after I think about it was an honor. I mean, the best honor a person, a human could ever have, that God believed that he was that good of a person.
Okay. So maybe honoring Job a bit here. Matt, and then Rick.
I think it's in John where there was the fellow that was born blind, and he was asked, was it he or his parents who sinned that this man was born blind? And I believe his response was, nobody sinned, it was for the glory of God.
Right.
So that I could heal him and show you that I am of God. And I think there's a sense in which that's the deal here too. And it's a difficult question because
Sure.
There's a sense in which God put Job through this. That seems like a bad thing. But God has his purposes. And obviously, Satan's the one who actually did these things. But in the big picture, it glorifies God. And we see how God works, how he takes care of us.
And it also came through self-righteous men that thought they were so righteous that God came down to know you got it all wrong.
Yeah.
So there was multiple lessons to be learned from that.
Yeah. Rick, and then Kim.
Yeah, there's one other little thing that kind of goes with what Matt is saying. Notice that Satan had to basically admit God's superiority, saying, well, you've got a hedge around him. I can't do anything.
Yeah.
So it was for his glory again.
Yeah.
Here in verse 6, Satan and the angels present themselves to God. I don't know what all that means, but there was this, they knew God, they'd seen God, they'd been in his presence. Job was a man living on the earth. He had faith, believed in God, was righteous, godly, all these things, shunned evil. And Satan's character or lack of faith, his lack of integrity, paled in comparison to Job, who'd never seen God.
Yeah.
Big contrast.
No, these are all good answers. And I think, first and foremost, the Bible doesn't tell us what God's ultimate purpose was. Now, certainly we can see the effects of it. As Matt pointed out, we can see that God is glorified by it. So doing this whole thing, Job going through what he's about to go through, that all went to God's glory. We can say it's for our edification because certainly we study Job all the time and we learn from it and we learn lessons about who God is. And so we glorify God and we get strength from these lessons. So that's another benefit of it. Ends up building some character for Job. Job gets a benefit of it. So there are many reasons that there are many consequences, many impacts that we can see from it. But the ultimate reason is not what is ever actually answered here in this book. We might say, why did Job endure the suffering he did? And as we're going to see, this book doesn't actually tell us why Job suffered. It tells us about God and his character and the nature of justice and how that's handled. That's what the book of Job is ultimately going to get at. It's very easy for us to hear about Job's great suffering and how he goes through a lot, and ultimately he's restored back to normal. And it's easy for us to think about this is a book about suffering. And really, it's not quite that, because we're never told why, for sure, that Job ends up going through this. And we'll see more of that as we go on through. One bonus question I have for you, and I don't expect answers now, but think about this for next time, okay? How was Satan able to come before God? Sin's not allowed in God's presence, right? That's why there were all those laws in Leviticus, right, about being able to consecrate yourself. You have to consecrate yourself. You can't do those things. And we know that Satan has done bad things, right? What's another name for Satan? The father of lies. He's the first liar, right? He introduced that. We see that all the way back in the garden. He lies to Eve. He deceives her, right? He's a deceiver. So these other sons of God, as they're called, these other angels, present themselves before God, and it says that Satan came among them to God. God's kind of holding this heavenly court, and here comes Satan. So how is it that Satan, being who he is able to be in the presence of the most holy God? So that's your bonus question. I expect some pondering on that one. So let's see if we can come up with a good answer for that. Now, moving on. Question number 4. It says, what important point lies in the fact that Satan had to come before God before he could do anything to Job? There's an important underlying point in the fact that Satan had to go to God before he could ever lay a finger on Job. Kim. God's in charge, right? Addie? He had to have permission. You know, in the modern world, God and Satan, they're often presented as these polar opposites, right? There's the battle between good and the battle between evil. And oftentimes, that's how it's presented. It's God versus Satan, right? And that's simply not the case, because Satan is not the opposite of God. He's bad, but he is nowhere equal in power to God. He's already lost the battle before it's even begun. So he is far, far inferior to where God is. And we see that in the fact that to even do anything to Job, he had to have permission first. He even references that fence that's built around Job. He can't touch Job without God's explicit say-so, right? So the underlying point here is that Satan does not have the power that the world often credits to him. That is simply just another lie, right? Okay. And then we kind of talked about this one already, question 5. What was Satan's charge against Job? It was the fact that, well, of course Job's going to be good. He's got everything. You've given everything to him. But if you take it away, if you give him some hardship, he's going to be upset with you, right? So that was kind of his charge against Job. And so question 6 asks us, considering the nature of this trial, what of Job's is being tested? Rick, Earl, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Matt,
So
I know your name.
it's sort of like a two-phase thing. In this phase, it's his possession as well that needs to be focused on.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely comes in 2 phases, and in this first one, it's his wealth, right? It's the possessions of Job, right?
He couldn't hurt his body.
Right, he couldn't hurt his body. That comes later, right? In this first phase, it's just his wealth that's being tested. Now, you could also look at this another way and say, what is the overall nature of the trial? You could say that God is testing Job's faith or his trust in him. You could look at it from that angle too. Either one would be acceptable answer, I think. Loyalty, yeah, all those things. I think those are all acceptable answers here. And so I think we'll pause here. We'll stop for tonight, and we'll pick up with the beginnings of Job's trials next week. So thank you, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. Just want to take a quick look at Numbers chapter 14. Remember when the children of Israel, they had basically chosen to believe the bad report of the spies, and they were afraid, and they were not trusting God, so they would not go in. They complained, they wanted to get rid of Moses, and they even went so far as wanting to stone Caleb and Joshua. Well, Moses ended up, asking God to forgive them and not wipe them out. And I want to start here with God's response in verses 20 through 25. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly, as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. Because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. Now the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valley. Tomorrow turn and move out into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. So now God has told them that they will not inherit the land, and this is because they're not trusting the Lord, even though he was with them and they had seen his miracles and his action. God tells them to leave tomorrow, the next day, and not go towards their enemies, but to go out away from their enemies, to travel into the wilderness. So then we can look at what God tells them through Moses, some verses down here in 29 through 31. And this is where it starts to get serious, the repercussions for them. The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in this wilderness, all of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old and above, except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun, you shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. But your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. So they will die in the wilderness. They will spend 40 years wandering and dying until all of those who were numbered 20 years and older are dead. Then their children can go in and claim the land. But God isn't done yet. If we look at verses 36 and 37, now the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation complain against him by bringing a bad report of the land, those very men who brought the evil report about the land died by the plague before the Lord. Now these 10 men, they weren't just any regular person they yanked out of the tribes. If you look back in chapter 13, verse 2, God had told Moses, send men to spy out the land of Canaan. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. So it was somebody important to those tribes. These were leaders. They were of some significance. Now, the people, after this, they began to mourn greatly. Now they start to become sorrowful. If we look at verses 39 through 45, then Moses told these words to all the children of Israel, and the people mourned greatly. And they rose early in the morning and went up to the top of the mountain, saying, here we are, and we will go up to the place which the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. And Moses said, now why do you transgress the command of the Lord? Remember, he had told them to leave away from their enemies. For this will not succeed. Do not go up, lest you be defeated by your enemies, for the Lord is not among you. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites are there before you, and, and you shall fall by the sword. Because you have turned away from the Lord will not be with you. But they presumed to go up to the mountaintop,
Nevertheless, neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed from the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that mountain came down and attacked them and drove them back as far as Hormah. Here again, they do not listen to God and they do not listen to Moses. And I bring all this up because these are all missed opportunities. They could have chosen to believe the good report that they got from Joshua and Caleb. They had the opportunity to trust God and not trust men. Instead, they were ready to dump Moses and God because they were afraid. And they had an opportunity that even if they were still going to disagree, they could have peacefully disagreed. But they were going to kill Caleb and Joshua instead. If God had not intervened, they most likely would have. Later, they had the opportunity to repent and change. But though they were sorrowful, they did not change. Again, they acted against what God had told them and what Moses told them, and then they were defeated by their enemies. Our opportunities in this lifetime are not infinite. We're only going to get so many opportunities. Some decisions, once they're made, they can't be undone. And sometimes, even if you're forgiven, the effects of certain actions and decisions will still remain. We don't want to pass up our opportunities with God. We want to make sure that we take advantage of our opportunities. We don't know how many we will get. Will there be another opportunity? Will there be another chance? We don't know. And I bring that up because here and now, this is a time, an opportunity. If anyone were to have any need for anything, prayers or assistance, this is a time that we've set aside for this. It is an opportunity. So I would just ask if you have any need or anything that you would please come forward, or you can even speak to us privately later if you do have any need or anything while we stand and sing.